Imagine this. A line of footprints pressed into ancient ash revealed for a moment as the light shifts at dawn, then slowly fading back into shadow. Traveller, you did not arrive here by accident. Across a planet more than 4 billion years old, you found this quiet edge of time where questions still echo. What if the story of humanity is not a single ascent, but a series of awakenings, each followed by forgetting? Ice cores preserve climates hundreds of thousands of years old, yet our written memory barely spans a breath of that time. Somewhere between those layers, something may have risen, flourished and slipped away. Picture a buried structure aligned to the stars, patient beneath sediment and sea, waiting without urgency. Science listens, myth remembers, and the silence between them grows meaningful. Let's drift a little deeper. The question of how many civilizations Earth has forgotten begins with an uncomfortable observation. Human history as it is usually presented occupies only a narrow slice of time. Written records stretch back a few thousand years at most. Yet anatomically modern humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, and the planet itself is more than 4 billion years old. When these scales are placed side by side, the imbalance is striking. Civilization, as officially remembered, appears not as a deep-rooted phenomenon but as a brief surface pattern. Geology provides the first challenge to the idea of continuity. Ice cores preserve atmospheric conditions from hundreds of thousands of years ago. Sediment layers record coastlines that advanced and retreated repeatedly. Volcanic ash isotope anomalies and erosion patterns testify to abrupt environmental changes as well as slow, relentless ones. Against this backdrop, the expectation that complex societies could emerge only once remain fragile yet unbroken, and then persist in a linear progression begins to feel less secure. Archaeology itself reflects this tension. The record is uneven, filled with sudden appearances and unexpected absences. In multiple regions, organized societies seem to emerge already equipped with agriculture, architecture, cosmology and law, with little evidence of long local experimentation leading up to them. Writing systems appear with surprising sophistication. Monumental construction begins almost immediately after supposed periods of cultural infancy. These developments are not impossible, but they are compressed in ways that invite scrutiny. Equally telling are the interruptions. Archaeological layers often reveal sharp declines rather than gradual transitions. Technologies vanish. Trade networks collapse. Urban life retreats or disappears entirely, sometimes for centuries. Later populations reoccupy the same land without understanding what their predecessors built, reusing stones and spaces, while losing the knowledge that once animated them. These are not isolated incidents but recurring patterns that resist being explained away as anomalies. This raises a fundamental question about progress itself. Progress assumes accumulation. It assumes that knowledge once discovered tends to persist and spread. Yet the material record repeatedly shows that knowledge can be lost completely when the systems that sustain it collapse. Skills disappear not because they were ineffective, but because the social, environmental, or institutional structures that supported them ceased to exist. In such cases, later societies do not inherit mastery. They inherit ruins. Mythology enters this discussion not as proof but as signal. Across cultures that developed independently, stories recur of earlier ages, lost worlds, floods, fires, and withdrawals of knowledge-bearing beings. These narratives are often dismissed as symbolic or psychological, but their persistence is difficult to ignore. They behave less like arbitrary inventions and more like memories abstracted for survival, preserving emotional truth when material continuity failed. Geology quietly reinforces this discomfort. Since the last glacial maximum, sea levels have risen more than 100 meters, submerging vast coastal plains that were once habitable and fertile. If early human populations like modern ones clustered near water, then a significant portion of their activity now lies beneath the ocean. These submerged landscapes are largely inaccessible and only lightly studied. The absence of evidence on land, therefore, cannot be treated as evidence of absence. Time alone is an efficient eraser. Erosion smooths stone. Sediment buries structures. Forests reclaim cities. Oceans swallow harbours. Without writing that survives and without continuous cultural transmission, even complex societies can dissolve into anonymity. What remains is not a clear record, but a negative space sensed through what feels missing rather than what is present. Tools appear too refined for their context. Alignments suggest long-term observation. Structures resist easy explanation. It is important to approach this uncertainty with restraint. Replacing one rigid narrative with another offers false comfort. The deeper insight may lie in accepting that history is layered rather than linear. Civilizations may rise as peaks of memory separated by long valleys of forgetting. Each believes itself unprecedented, unaware of how many similar peaks have already eroded into the background. From this perspective, forgetting is not an anomaly but a pattern. Geological time stretches endlessly documented in stone and ice, while human time collapses inward, compressed into fragile records. Earth remembers almost everything in some form. Humanity remembers very little. This imbalance alone warrants caution when making claims about origins and uniqueness. Collapse does not require dramatic catastrophe. A shift in climate, a failure of trade-prolonged drought, or gradual sea level rise can be enough. When systems strain, survival takes priority over preservation. Writing becomes a luxury. Specialized knowledge narrows. Within a few generations, memory contracts to the immediate and the oral. Oral memory can preserve meaning, but it is vulnerable to disruption. When continuity breaks, detail dissolves rapidly. The archaeological record bears this out. There are sites where advanced stonework lies beneath simpler constructions, as if later peoples inherited the remains of complexity without inheriting understanding. This inversion challenges the assumption that complexity always builds upon itself. It suggests instead that complexity can recede, leaving behind fragments that future societies struggle to contextualize. Seen this way, the question is no longer merely how many civilizations Earth has forgotten, but what conditions allow any civilization to be remembered at all. Memory depends on stability, transmission, and preservation, all of which are contingent. When these fail, forgetting follows quietly without announcement, carried by time itself. This realization carries an unsettling implication. If forgetting is normal, then permanence is the illusion. Entire worlds may have risen and vanished with barely a whisper, leaving behind only subtle distortions in the record. The present moment feels different only because it is inhabited. From a distance it may one day appear just as thin, just as incomplete. The possibility that Earth has forgotten civilizations does not demand belief in lost golden ages or advanced prehistoric empires. It demands humility. It asks that the limits of preservation be acknowledged, that silence not be mistaken for emptiness, and that the deep rhythms of the planet be taken seriously. In this light, history becomes not a closed book, but a layered landscape, much of it still unread. One of the strongest obstacles to recognizing forgotten civilizations lies in how evidence survives. Archaeology is shaped not only by what once existed, but by what endures. Materials decay at different rates. Wood fibre and earth vanish quickly. Metal corrodes. Stone persists longest, yet even stone erodes, fractures, and is repurposed. When societies rely on materials that do not endure their absence, can appear indistinguishable from non-existence. Preservation bias quietly shapes what is considered possible. Scale compounds this problem. Archaeology reconstructs wholes from fragments, patterns from remnants. This method is powerful, but it is also constrained by expectation. When a framework becomes established, new findings are often interpreted to fit it. Anomalies are smoothed over, labeled transitional, symbolic, or coincidental. This is not deception. It is cognition seeking coherence. Yet coherence achieved too early can harden into blindness. The archaeological record contains moments that resist easy placement. Techniques appear refined beyond what their context would suggest. Stonework displays precision without clear developmental stages. Astronomical alignments imply long-term observation across generations. These features are often treated as isolated achievements rather than products of inherited systems. When examined individually, they can be rationalized. When viewed collectively, they begin to suggest interruption rather than origin. Technology tends to spread once discovered. Useful techniques evolve, adapt, and leave descendants. When they vanish entirely, the disappearance usually reflects disruption, severe enough to sever transmission. Later cultures sometimes encounter remnants They cannot reproduce reusing stones or occupying ruins while lacking the knowledge that created them. This pattern appears repeatedly across continents and eras, hinting at loss rather than invention. Civilization does not always advance through replacement. Often it advances through occupation. New societies step into spaces left behind by others, inheriting landscapes without inheriting understanding. Structures are reinterpreted through myth or ritual. Practical functions become symbolic. Over time, meaning drifts while form remains. The structure survives, but its context dissolves. Environmental instability magnifies this process. Earth's climate history is not a backdrop, but an active force. Sea levels rise and fall by hundreds of feet. Ice sheets advance and retreat, grinding landscapes down to bedrock. Entire regions that may once have supported dense populations are later scoured clean. When ice retreats, the land appears ancient and untouched, even if it once hosted complex life. Coastal environments are particularly vulnerable to erasure. Since the end of the last ice age, vast continental shelves have been submerged. Plains larger than modern nations disappeared beneath rising seas. If early human societies developed along coasts, as migration evidence suggests, then much of their activity now lies underwater. Archaeology remains largely blind beneath the ocean, not because nothing is there, but because access is difficult. Occasional underwater discoveries complicate the picture. Submerged stone alignments and terraces provoke debate, then often recede into obscurity due to the challenges of study. What cannot be easily categorized is rarely integrated into broader narratives. As a result, the sea becomes treated as a void rather than an archive. Yet water preserves as well as erases. Patterns endure even when materials collapse. Ice has played a similar role. Glacial advances destroy surface traces almost completely. Regions once habitable become stripped to bare rock. When warming returns, little remains to indicate prior occupation. This creates the illusion of beginnings, where there may have been recoveries. The absence of surface evidence becomes mistaken for absence of history. Abrupt climate events intensify these effects. Sudden shifts such as the Younger Dryas disrupted ecosystems rapidly. Food sources changed, habitable zones contracted. Under such conditions, survival demanded adaptation, not record-keeping. Knowledge narrowed to what sustained life. Anything beyond that was abandoned. This narrowing leaves a distinctive signature. Complexity recedes sharply, then re-emerges later without clear lineage. From the outside, this appears as regression. From within, it is triage. Society focused on endurance shed excess. Specialized knowledge disappears not because it lacks value, but because it cannot be carried forward. When conditions stabilize, rebuilding occurs from a reduced base. What emerges may resemble innovation, but it may equally be recovery without memory. This reframing alters how early cultural leaps are interpreted. Sudden appearances of art symbolism or organized settlement need not mark awakenings from nothing. They may represent reassemblies of capacity already present. Anatomically, modern humans existed long before these expressions became visible. The mind did not suddenly ignite. Continuity may simply have returned long enough to leave a trace. Myth and oral tradition preserve another dimension of this pattern. Across cultures, stories recur of earlier worlds, floods, fires, and lost knowledge. These narratives are often dismissed as metaphor, yet some encode specific environmental details that align with geological reconstructions. Coastlines described where none exist today. Animals remembered that vanished millennia ago. These are not literal records, but they are not arbitrary. Oral transmission can preserve memory with remarkable stability, when continuity remains intact. What destroys it is not time, but disruption. Forced migration, cultural collapse, and language loss unravel memory quickly. Within a few generations, detailed remembrance becomes abstraction. Symbols remain while meaning thins. This helps explain why myths feel incomplete, gesturing towards something larger without fully naming it. Written history, by contrast, appears precise, but is highly selective. Writing favors institutions, administration, and power. What survives reflects priorities rather than total experience. When writing systems collapse, the loss is immediate and severe. Libraries vanish. Calendars reset. Chronologies fracture. New regimes overwrite old narratives, often unconsciously in the process of stabilizing authority. This interaction between oral memory and written record creates blind spots. Myths are dismissed as fiction. Texts are treated as fact. Yet myths often preserve emotional and experiential truth that texts omit, while texts may distort events to serve legitimacy. Read separately, both mislead. Read together, they suggest repeated disruption rather than smooth ascent. Catastrophic events punctuate Earth's history. Volcanic eruptions, impacts, and rapid climate reversals are documented in ash layers, craters, and isotopic shifts. The debate lies not in their occurrence, but in how often they intersected with human presence. Even a single global-scale disruption layered onto existing stress could erase centuries of accumulated knowledge without erasing humanity itself. Civilization depends on alignment, stable environment, cooperative systems, and continuity of transmission. When this alignment fails, collapse follows not as punishment, but as consequence. Knowledge dissolves faster than species. What remains is residue rather than record. Over time, repeated collapses flatten history, compressing complexity into a few visible peaks separated by long valleys of silence. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, the forgetting may not be total. It may persist as structure rather than narrative, as patterns embedded in myth alignment and habit. The question then shifts, not whether civilizations existed before, but how often continuity failed. In that light, the apparent youth of civilization becomes less certain, and the silence before it feels increasingly crowded. Another layer of difficulty in recognizing forgotten civilizations lies in how history is curated rather than merely preserved. Memory does not survive on its own. It is copied, taught, and selected. Every act of preservation is also an act of exclusion. Over long spans of time, this selective process shapes what feels real, and what fades into implausibility. The past that reaches the present is not a neutral inheritance, but an archive assembled under specific pressures. Institutions play a central role in this process. States, empires, and religious systems preserve records that support legitimacy, continuity, and authority. Genealogies are clarified, origins are simplified, timelines are shortened to fit governance and belief, events that complicate stability are softened, reframed, or omitted. This is rarely deliberate erasure. It is the natural consequence of administration attempting to impose coherence on inherited fragments. When civilization collapses and new systems rise, rewriting becomes unavoidable. New authorities inherit remnants of older worlds and rearrange them to serve present needs. Older knowledge that does not translate into immediate utility often decays. Over generations, reinterpretation replaces memory itself. What survives appears inevitable. What is lost begins to feel unreal, speculative, or mythical. This process can be observed even in well-documented eras. Victors frame defeats as necessary sacrifices. Religious reforms reinterpret earlier practices as corruptions rather than continuations. Competing chronologies are streamlined until ambiguity disappears. Over time, provisional interpretations harden into orthodoxy. The past becomes orderly but at the cost of depth. If this narrowing occurs over centuries, its effect over millennia becomes profound. Each collapse compresses the archive further. Each reconstruction simplifies origins. Each generation assumes it stands closer to the beginning than it actually does. Forgetting emerges not as conspiracy, but as momentum. Complexity is heavy. It is expensive to preserve. Simplicity travels farther. Knowledge that does not serve immediate governance is especially fragile. Technical expertise without obvious application. Cosmological models that challenge prevailing frameworks. Accounts of earlier societies that undermine claims of uniqueness. These forms of memory require active protection. Without it, they fade quickly, not because they are false, but because they are inconvenient. Archaeology itself is not immune to this dynamic. Research priorities shape interpretation. Sites that promise clarity are favoured over those that raise discomfort. Discoveries that fit existing frameworks are integrated efficiently. Those that do not often remain marginal, debated quietly, rarely emphasized. This is not deception. It is institutional inertia. Systems are designed to stabilize narratives, not destabilize them. The result is a subtle smoothing of history. Fractures become footnotes. Discontinuities are reframed as transitions. Over time, the sense that history might be layered, interrupted, or cyclical diminishes. A linear story replaces a complex one. Linearity is comforting. It implies progress. It suggests direction rather than repetition. Yet comfort is not evidence. Earlier thinkers were often more comfortable with uncertainty than modern narratives suggest. Ancient chronologies frequently extended far beyond current accepted timelines. Cycles of destruction and renewal were discussed without embarrassment. These perspectives were later streamlined as methods of measurement improved. Precision replaced speculation. What could not be dated reliably was set aside. This caution was understandable, but it carried unintended consequences. Large portions of human possibility were amputated not because they were disproven, but because they were difficult to integrate. As data increased, acceptable history narrowed. The paradox emerged: more information about recent millennia, less tolerance for deep uncertainty about what preceded them. If forgotten civilizations existed, their recognition would challenge more than chronology. It would challenge authority. It would suggest that institutions tasked with preserving truth are also participants in forgetting, not as villains, but as inheritors of systems that reward stability over doubt. This realization need not produce cynicism. It can produce humility. Humility reframes history as provisional rather than complete. Memory becomes an ongoing negotiation between what survives, what is valued, and what is allowed to matter. When conditions change, memory changes with them. Entire epics may have been filtered out not through malice, but through relevance. They did not serve the needs of those who followed, and so they faded. Forgetting, then, is not only ancient, it is ongoing. New discoveries emerge as anomalies surface briefly, then recede when they resist easy placement. What future narratives are being shaped by present choices? What questions are being postponed because they complicate coherence? The archive of tomorrow is being assembled now under pressures as real as those of the past. Objects that sit outside explanation are particularly revealing. Artifacts appear in isolation, lacking clear lineage. Their sophistication feels oddly localized. Techniques seem optimized rather than experimental. Then they vanish. Later cultures do not refine them. They replace them with simpler solutions. This pattern suggests interruption rather than exhaustion. Technology depends on transmission. Without continuity, usefulness alone cannot guarantee survival. In the distant past, knowledge was embodied in practice rather than abstracted into diagrams. When practitioners disappeared, their skills vanished with them. What remained were products without context, mute and misleading. From a distance, they appear premature. From within their own time, they may have been late. This perspective shifts interpretation away from exceptional genius or external intervention. It emphasizes continuity as the quiet engine of civilization. When continuity fails, progress resets. Advancement becomes episodic rather than cumulative. Peaks rise, then flatten. The archaeological record is full of such flattened peaks. Visibility further distorts perception. What stands out is what surprises. Objects that fit expectation blend into the background. Anomalies attract attention precisely because they resist explanation. Yet visibility is not proportional to importance. A forgotten civilization might leave behind a handful of striking remnants and vast fields of ordinary tools absorbed into generic categories. Over time, only the strange remains noticeable. This selective visibility creates the illusion of isolation. Remnants feel disconnected when they may once have been integral parts of coherent systems. What survives are punctuation marks rather than sentences. Technologies optimized for specific environments vanish when those environments change. Their abandonment looks like regression, but it is often adaptation. Loss in this sense does not imply ignorance. It implies shift. Survival does not always reward sophistication. Forgotten civilizations, if they existed, would not resemble modern progress narratives. Their technological footprints would be uneven context, specific and discontinuous. They would leave puzzles rather than blueprints. These puzzles provoke unease because they suggest alternative trajectories. Not all futures converge on the present. Some were explored briefly, then terminated by circumstance. This destabilizes confidence in inevitability. It suggests that what is preserved is shaped as much by chance as by merit. As anomalies accumulate, pressure builds to integrate them rather than dismiss them. Integration does not require certainty. It requires tolerance for unresolved complexity. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, their traces may appear not as clear ancestors, but as interruptions that resist compression into a single line. The implication is subtle but profound. Knowledge can be advanced and temporary. Sophistication does not guarantee endurance. Continuity is fragile. Without it, even the most refined understanding becomes a dead end. The artifacts that trouble categorization may be less important for what they prove than for what they imply that forgetting is efficient, and that civilization's greatest vulnerability lies not in its tools but in its memory. A further complication arises when attention shifts from material remains to patterns of thought. Civilization is often measured by what it builds, yet some of the most enduring traces of complex societies are not physical at all. They exist in systems of timekeeping, in shared assumptions about order, in recurring ways of interpreting the sky and the land. These cognitive structures can persist long after the societies that formed them have vanished detached from their original context and mistaken for intuitive or universal insights. Astronomy offers a striking example. Across ancient cultures, precise observations of celestial cycles appear, embedded in architecture, ritual calendars, and mythic narratives. Solar solstices, lunar standstills, and stellar risings are tracked with an accuracy that requires long-term observation across generations. Such precision implies continuity and patience, not improvisation. Yet these systems often appear suddenly in the archaeological record without clear local development, and sometimes disappear just as abruptly. Calendrical knowledge is not easily invented in isolation. It depends on stable observation points, intergenerational transmission, and social structures that value long-term coherence over immediate survival. When such structures collapse, the knowledge does not necessarily vanish entirely, it fragments. Pieces persist as ritual tradition or symbolism divorced from the empirical framework that once supported them. Over time, what was once practical becomes sacred, and what was once measured becomes mythologized. This process creates an illusion of origin. Later societies inherit fragments of earlier systems and reinterpret them as foundational discoveries. The knowledge feels new because its lineage is broken. The calendar, the alignment, the myth survives, but the context that explains why it exists does not. When this happens repeatedly, history begins to resemble a series of inventions rather than a sequence of recoveries. Language and symbolism show similar patterns. Early symbolic artifacts often appear with confidence rather than hesitation. They do not resemble tentative experiments, but established conventions. This is difficult to reconcile with the idea that symbolic thought emerged gradually from simplicity. Anatomically, modern humans existed long before these expressions became visible. Cognitive capacity was present. What fluctuated was continuity. One explanation for this delay is population density. Symbolic systems stabilize only when communities reach sufficient size and interconnectedness. When populations fragment, innovation stalls. When they reconnect, it accelerates. Under this view, cognitive leaps are not awakenings but reassemblies. They occur when conditions allow scattered capacity to converge and persist long enough to leave durable traces. Catastrophe intensifies this rhythm. Environmental shocks force societies to reorganize meaning. In the aftermath of disruptions, art, ritual, and narrative often intensify. These are not luxuries but tools for coherence. They encode lessons, warnings, and shared identity in forms resilient enough to survive when infrastructure fails. This gives early symbolic expression a gravity that is often overlooked. It is not playful. It is serious, shaped by experience rather than curiosity alone. Seen through this lens, early art and myth become acts of preservation rather than discovery. They represent attempts to anchor meaning in a world known to be unstable. Their sudden appearance may reflect not the birth of thought, but the survival of thought after interruption. Their disappearance may reflect not cognitive regression, but renewed disruption. This reframing helps explain why advances cluster in time. Innovation surges, then slows. Complexity expands, then plateaus. These rhythms do not resemble a smooth ascent. They resemble pulses. Each pulse requires a window of stability. When the window closes, continuity breaks and memory contracts. Maps provide another revealing case. Certain ancient representations of the world trouble historians not because they are obviously wrong, but because they appear unexpectedly precise. Coastlines resemble modern surveys more than symbolic sketches. Proportions suggest careful measurement rather than guesswork. In some cases, features align with landscapes altered or erased long before the era in which the maps were supposedly produced. These artifacts are often explained cautiously. They are said to be later copies of earlier originals, educated guesses refined by travellers' reports, or coincidences amplified by selective interpretation. Each explanation is plausible. Yet taken together, they leave unease. Precision rarely appears without lineage. Cartography is not merely drawing. It is accumulated observation standardized across time. Mapping requires continuity. It depends on shared reference points, conventions, and correction. When continuity fails, maps become abstract or symbolic. Accuracy is the reward of stability. This makes certain ancient representations difficult to place within accepted timelines. The problem is not that they are perfect, but that they are competent in ways that feel out of place. Orientation deepens this discomfort. Many early maps prioritize coastlines, currents, and passages over political boundaries. Land is framed in relation to water rather than authority. This perspective feels older, shaped by the movement rather than control. If earlier civilizations were maritime or heavily coastal, their way of seeing the world would differ fundamentally from later land-based empires. Over time, copies degrade, errors accumulate, symbols lose meaning, yet underlying proportions can persist beneath layers of reinterpretation. Like myths, maps can survive trauma by changing form while retaining structure. This parallel is instructive. Just as oral traditions preserve emotional memory, maps may preserve spatial memory. Both outlive the systems that created them. When such artifacts are examined in isolation, they are treated as curiosities. The possibility that they might share a deeper source is rarely explored openly. Doing so would require entertaining continuity beyond accepted chronologies, and that prospect unsettles foundational assumptions. Yet the artifacts themselves do not argue. They simply exist. This introduces a crucial distinction between the age of an object and the age of the knowledge it contains. A map produced in one era may encode information inherited from another. Dating the material does not necessarily date the insight embedded within it. The same applies to astronomical alignments, measurement systems, and mathematical conventions. Knowledge can persist long after the societies that generated it have disappeared. If forgotten civilizations existed, their intellectual footprints may be hiding in plain sight. Not as monuments, but as conventions treated as natural rather than inherited. Directions taken for granted. Measures assumed to be intuitive. Patterns accepted without question. These remnants do not announce loss. They blend seamlessly into what follows. This realization shifts the focus again. The question becomes not how much was lost, but how much survived unnoticed. How many starting points are actually midpoints mistaken for beginnings? The reluctance to ask such questions stems from a desire for closure. Origins feel reassuring when they are close and clear. Pushing them further back introduces uncertainty that feels destabilizing. Yet uncertainty is not emptiness. It is presence without clarity. The persistence of precise but contextless knowledge suggests that memory can operate on scales not easily tracked by conventional history. Information can drift across centuries detached from its creators waiting to be recognized. If earlier civilizations navigated the world differently, their perspective may endure even if their names do not. Their roots may persist in tradition. Their measurements may survive in practice. Their understanding may echo faintly in systems we no longer question. This does not diminish later achievements. It contextualizes them. History seen this way is neither a straight ascent nor a closed cycle. It is layered, cumulative, in some places interrupted in others. Earth reshapes itself relentlessly. Coastlines shift. poles wander, climate reorganizes life. Against this motion, human attempts at order are provisional. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, it may not have erased them entirely. It may have compressed them into structure rather than story. Their presence lingers not as names or dates, but as subtle alignments, inherited assumptions and unresolved puzzles. The challenge is not to force conclusions, but to recognize that what feels complete may be only the most recent layer of a much deeper record. When the idea of forgotten civilizations is followed to its deepest implications, it begins to challenge not only history but how civilization understands itself. The assumption that complexity naturally accumulates over time rests on a belief in continuity. Yet continuity is not guaranteed. It is a fragile condition dependent on environment transmission and collective attention. When any of these fail, collapse does not arrive as spectacle, but as quiet misalignment. From this perspective, civilization appears less like a permanent achievement and more like a temporary configuration. It emerges when knowledge resources and stability briefly align, and it dissolves when that alignment fractures. Collapse does not require extinction. It requires interruption. Knowledge narrows, systems simplify. What follows may survive biologically but not culturally. The species endures while the civilization disappears. This reframing alters how catastrophe is understood. Large-scale disruptions need not be frequent to shape history profoundly. A single event layered atop existing stress can unravel centuries of accumulated structure. Volcanic winters, abrupt climate reversals, or impacts need not erase humanity to erase memory. They only need to disrupt the conditions under which complexity can be maintained. When agriculture fails, trade collapses, and populations disperse, continuity breaks quickly. In such moments, survival favors immediacy over abstraction. Specialized knowledge becomes impractical. Long-term planning gives way to short-term endurance. Writing systems vanish. Measurement systems fragment. What remains are stories, rituals, and habits that can be carried without infrastructure. Over time, these remnants are mistaken for origins rather than survivals. This dynamic explains why the archaeological record often shows long periods of apparent simplicity following bursts of innovation. These intervals are not necessarily evidence of slow development. They may represent recovery phases after disruption. What looks like a beginning may in fact be a resurfacing the first moment that escaped erasure by chance rather than design. Seen this way, the apparent youth of civilization becomes misleading. The earliest visible layers may not be the first, but the earliest that endured. Earlier attempts may have risen and fallen without leaving durable traces. Their absence does not imply insignificance. It implies vulnerability. Complexity that does not anchor itself in resilient memory dissolves rapidly. This leads to a more unsettling realization. If forgetting follows collapse as reliably as collapse follows instability, then civilization's greatest threat is not external catastrophe, but internal fragility. Systems grow efficient, interconnected, and specialized. These qualities enable expansion, but they also amplify vulnerability. Interdependence reduces redundancy. When disruption occurs, failure cascades. Modern civilization often assumes that scale and technology guarantee resilience. Information is stored across networks. Knowledge is externalized into systems. This creates an impression of permanence, yet externalized memory is brittle. When systems fail, loss is immediate and comprehensive. Earlier societies lost libraries but retained oral memory. A system that loses both risks total amnesia. This raises a difficult question about the future of memory. If civilizations before failed to preserve awareness of fragility, they may have repeated mistakes without recognizing them. Each iteration may have believed itself unprecedented, confident in its tools, unaware of how ordinary that confidence was. From within, every civilization feels exceptional. From a distance, patterns emerge. Those patterns suggest that forgetting is not an error to be corrected once, but a tendency to be managed continually. Memory does not preserve itself automatically. It must be cultivated deliberately, especially in times of stability, when forgetting feels least urgent. Awareness of limits, vulnerability, and recurrence is difficult to encode in institutions designed to reward growth and certainty. Ancient philosophies often emphasized this awareness. They warned against excess imbalance and hubris. These warnings were not abstract moralizing. They were survival insights encoded in durable forms. Over time, however, reminders become habits. Habits lose urgency. Symbols outlive their reference. What once warned begins to reassure. The cycle resumes. If forgotten civilizations existed, they may not ask to be rediscovered. They may ask to be recognized as predecessors in a shared condition. Their absence reflects not failure, but participation in a pattern larger than any single society. Earth does not judge these outcomes. It records them impersonally, compressing effort, intention, and belief into layers that appear flat from the surface. This understanding does not demand pessimism. Cycles are not condemnations. They describe pressures, not destinies. Awareness alters response. A civilization that recognizes its own fragility may behave differently from one that assumes permanence. It may prioritize continuity over expansion, resilience over efficiency, remembrance over accumulation. Whether such balance is possible at scale remains uncertain. Complexity tends to undermine its own foundations. The tension between growth and endurance may be insoluble, yet acknowledging the tension itself has value. It reframes history not as a story of inevitable ascent, but as a series of attempts to stabilize meaning in a restless world. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, it has done so without malice. Forgetting is written into the mechanics of time erosion and change. What matters is not whether earlier worlds vanished, but whether anything essential passed through intact. Not monuments or names, but awareness of fragility itself. In that sense, the question of forgotten civilizations becomes less about the past and more about responsibility. Memory is not guaranteed by achievement. It must be practiced against the grain of time. Whether that practice can endure remains unknown. The silence left by earlier worlds offers no answer, only a reminder: continuity is rare and forgetting is efficient. The final tension emerges when the idea of forgotten civilizations is applied to the present. History often treats collapse as something safely behind us, a condition belonging to distant worlds less informed or less capable than our own. Yet the mechanisms that dissolve memory are not relics of the past. They are active processes operating quietly within modern systems shaped by the same forces that have always governed complexity. Civilizations do not disappear all at once. They thin. Attention narrows. Meaning is delegated to systems that grow too large to be understood by those who rely on them. Memory becomes externalized into archives, databases, and institutions, assumed to be permanent because they are extensive. This assumption is new, but the vulnerability it creates is not. Externalized memory can vanish faster than embodied memory when continuity breaks. The modern world excels at storing information, yet struggles to preserve understanding. Data accumulates, but context decays. Knowledge fragments into specializations that rarely communicate. The result is breadth without cohesion. In such an environment, loss does not announce itself as absence. It appears as overload, as noise, overwhelming signal, as relevance replacing meaning. This condition mirrors patterns visible in earlier collapses. When societies grow complex, they optimize for efficiency. Redundancy is reduced. Interdependence increases. These traits enable expansion but amplify fragility. When disruption occurs, failure propagates quickly. Recovery becomes difficult not because resources are insufficient, but because coherence has already dissolved. What distinguishes modern civilization is scale rather than immunity. Global systems allow knowledge to spread rapidly, but they also synchronize failure. A disruption that once might have remained local now ripples outward. In earlier eras, collapse could be uneven, leaving pockets of continuity elsewhere. Today, continuity itself is globally entangled. This raises an unsettling possibility. If forgetting is structural rather than accidental, then advanced systems may accelerate it rather than prevent it. The more civilization relies on complex infrastructures to remember for it, the less practiced it becomes at remembering internally. When systems fail, the loss is not partial, it is total. Earlier societies preserved memory through repetition, ritual, and narrative embedded in daily life. These methods were limited in scale but resilient under disruption. Modern memory is powerful but brittle. It excels under stability and collapses under stress. The trade-off is rarely acknowledged because stability has been extended long enough to feel permanent. The question then becomes whether awareness of this fragility can alter outcomes. Awareness does not guarantee survival, but it shapes response. A civilization that understands itself as temporary may prioritize continuity differently from one that assumes permanence. It may value maintenance over novelty, resilience over optimization, and humility over certainty. Yet such priorities run against the grain of expansion. Growth rewards speed, innovation, and efficiency. Endurance rewards restraint, redundancy, and patience. The tension between these goals is difficult to reconcile. Throughout history, civilizations have tended to choose growth not because endurance is unknown, but because growth is immediately rewarded. If forgotten civilizations existed, they likely faced the same tension. They may have possessed insight without the means to preserve it across disruption. They may have understood cycles without being able to escape them. Their loss then is not a failure of intelligence, but a limitation of structure. This reframing shifts how responsibility is understood. The past is no longer a sequence of mistakes to be avoided once and for all. It becomes a set of pressures to be managed continuously. Civilization is not something achieved and secured. It is something practiced, maintained, and renegotiated across time. From this perspective, the silence left by vanished societies becomes instructive. It suggests that the most fragile element of civilization is not technology, governance, or belief, but awareness of fragility itself. When awareness fades, repetition becomes likely. And mistakes are not remembered as mistakes. They are re-experienced as novelty. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, it may have done so because awareness was lost before catastrophe arrived. Memory narrowed to immediate function. Long-term perspective dissolved. What remained was confidence untempered by caution. This pattern does not require moral failure. It arises naturally when systems outgrow understanding. The present moment carries no exemption from this pattern. Confidence is abundant. Tools are powerful. Memory appears secure. Yet these conditions are precisely when forgetting is least noticed. Stability dulls vigilance. The absence of a recent global collapse is mistaken for immunity. Whether this trajectory can be altered remains uncertain. History does not offer guarantees, only tendencies. Cycles describe pressures, not destinies. Awareness can stretch continuity even if it cannot eliminate risk. The question is whether awareness itself can be preserved when it is least convenient. In the end, forgotten civilizations may matter less as lost worlds than as mirrors. They reflect a shared condition rather than a distant mystery. Their absence reminds us that civilization is not judged by what it builds, but by what it carries forward when building is no longer possible. If something essential can endure through disruption, it will not be monuments or data. It will be understanding of limits, respect for cycles, and the recognition that continuity is rare. Without that recognition, forgetting is efficient, and the future will encounter the present much as we encounter the past as fragments, puzzles, and unanswered questions compressed into silence. At a certain depth of reflection, the idea of forgotten civilization stops feeling speculative and begins to feel structural. It no longer asks whether earlier worlds existed, but why the conditions that allow worlds to remember themselves are so rare. The recurring pattern across history is not failure of intelligence, but failure of continuity. Civilizations do not vanish because they lack ingenuity. They vanish because ingenuity alone cannot carry memory across disruption. Continuity depends on more than survival. It requires stable transmission across generations, shared meaning and systems, capable of preserving understanding rather than artifacts alone. When any of these weaken memory thins, knowledge fragments into techniques without context, symbols persist without explanation, practices remain long after their purpose has faded. Over time, the civilization that produced them becomes invisible even while its residue endures. This helps explain why many ancient achievements feel simultaneously impressive and incomplete. Stone structures align with celestial cycles, yet the reasoning behind them is debated. Measurement systems appear standardized, yet their origins are uncertain. Technologies emerge with confidence, yet leave few descendants. These traces do not point cleanly to beginnings. They suggest survivals, what remained after something larger failed to carry itself forward. The difficulty lies in how modern thinking frames evidence. There is an implicit assumption that complexity should increase steadily, that knowledge once gained naturally accumulates. When the record contradicts this expectation, explanations tend to narrow rather than expand. Achievements are labelled exceptional. Losses are localised. Broader patterns are avoided because they threaten the coherence of the linear narrative. Yet coherence achieved through compression conceals vulnerability. A civilization that believes itself the first of its kind is less prepared to recognise signs of repetition. It treats collapse as anomaly rather than possibility. It attributes past failures to ignorance rather than structure. In doing so, it overlooks the conditions that made forgetting likely in the first place. Historical distance intensifies this effect. From within a civilization, confidence feels earned. Tools work, systems function, knowledge circulates. The idea that continuity could break appears remote. Only after collapse does fragility become obvious. From that vantage, what seems stable reveals itself as contingent, dependent on alignments that were never guaranteed. This is why myths of earlier ages persist even when stripped of detail. They encode not dates or mechanisms, but recognition of loss. They express the intuition that something once existed and no longer does, and that the absence matters. The persistence of such narratives across cultures suggests that forgetting has been experienced repeatedly enough to leave an imprint on collective imagination. When these stories are dismissed entirely, an opportunity is missed, not because they offer literal histories, but because they preserve awareness of fragility. They warn that stability is temporary, that order can dissolve, and that memory must be guarded deliberately. In this sense, myth functions as a backup system for memory when formal records fail. The archaeological record supports this interpretation indirectly. Peaks of complexity are followed by long plateaus or declines. Regions once dense with activity become quiet. Technologies vanish. Population disperses. When complexity returns, it often does so differently adapted to new conditions, carrying fragments rather than blueprints. What follows is not restoration, but reconstruction without memory. This cycle does not require identical repetition. Each iteration differs in scale, environment, and expression, but the structure remains recognizable: growth, interdependence, fragility, disruption, simplification, and re-emergence. The intervals between these phases may span centuries or millennia, placing them beyond the reach of written memory. What survives is often the last iteration mistaken for the first. Understanding this does not diminish human achievement. It contextualizes it. It replaces triumphal narratives with resilient ones. Civilization becomes not a destination, but a balance that must be actively maintained. Progress becomes conditional rather than inevitable. Memory becomes a practice rather than a byproduct. The question of forgotten civilizations, then, is less about proving their existence, and more about recognizing their implication. If forgetting is efficient and continuity is rare, then the survival of understanding becomes the central challenge. Tools can be rebuilt, structures can be reconstructed, but awareness of fragility once lost is difficult to recover. Modern society faces this challenge in a new form. Its memory systems are vast, but its dependence on them is total. When memory is externalized completely, awareness atrophies. Understanding is replaced by access. Meaning is replaced by retrieval. In such a system, collapse threatens not just infrastructure but comprehension itself. Earlier societies lost libraries but retained lived memory. Modern systems risk losing both simultaneously. This does not imply inevitability, but it does underscore vulnerability. The more complex a system becomes, the more effort is required to preserve awareness of its limits. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, their most important lesson may not lie in what they built, but in what they could not preserve. The absence suggests that memory does not survive automatically. It must be renewed deliberately even when conditions feel stable, especially then. The silence left by vanished worlds is not empty. It is dense with pattern. It suggests that civilization left unattended tends toward forgetting. The task then is not to escape cycles entirely, but to recognize them in time to respond differently. Whether such recognition can endure remains uncertain. History offers no assurance, it offers only precedent. Forgotten civilizations may not ask to be found. They may ask to be understood as echoes of a shared condition, reminders that continuity is fragile, and that awareness once lost is the most difficult thing to rebuild. At the far edge of this inquiry, the idea of forgotten civilizations becomes less about discovery and more about recognition. The question no longer centers on what might be hidden beneath ice or sea, but on why the human story repeatedly narrows itself. Again and again, complexity rises, organizes, and then thins, leaving behind traces that feel incomplete rather than erased. This incompleteness is not accidental. It reflects the limits of how memory survives. Civilizations tend to remember success more readily than failure. Achievements are recorded, celebrated, and replicated. Collapse, by contrast, is reframed as exception. When it cannot be ignored, it is attributed to unique misfortune or moral weakness. This framing protects confidence, but it obscures structure. It prevents societies from recognizing that collapse is not an aberration, but a recurring risk inherent in complexity itself. From within a civilization, this blindness is difficult to detect. Stability produces the illusion of permanence. Systems that work today are assumed to work tomorrow. The mechanisms that sustain order become invisible precisely because they function. Only when they fail does their fragility become clear. By then, continuity is already compromised. This delayed awareness explains why civilizations rarely anticipate their own forgetting. Attention is consumed by immediate challenges and rewards. Growth, efficiency, and innovation dominate priorities. Memory is delegated to institutions, archives, and technologies assumed to be durable. The practice of remembering becomes specialized, removed from daily life, and therefore more vulnerable to disruption. When disruption arrives, it rarely announces itself as catastrophe. It often appears as a series of adjustments, each reasonable in isolation. Resources are redirected. Redundancy is reduced. Specialized knowledge is postponed. Over time, the cumulative effect is profound. The system loses depth. Understanding is replaced by function. Memory becomes shallow long before collapse becomes visible. This process can be seen retrospectively in the archaeological record. Long before cities' empty inscriptions stop. Long before monuments fall, maintenance declines. Long before collapse is named, continuity erodes. What follows is not sudden disappearance, but gradual thinning until the civilization becomes archaeologically quiet. If earlier civilizations were forgotten, they were likely forgotten this way. Not through dramatic inoculation alone, but through narrowing attention and misplaced confidence. The Earth then completed the process, impartially compressing remains into layers erasing context while preserving fragments. The unsettling implication is that forgetting is not imposed from outside, it emerges from within. It is the byproduct of success unexamined. When complexity grows faster than awareness, the conditions for memory deteriorate. This pattern does not require ignorance, it requires distraction. Modern civilization is not exempt. Its tools are unprecedented, but its cognitive constraints are familiar. Information is abundant, yet understanding competes with volume. Memory is vast, yet increasingly externalized. The assumption that data equals remembrance masks a deeper vulnerability. Data persists, but meaning requires continuity. This distinction matters. A future society encountering the remnants of the present may find abundant artifacts but little coherence. Digital records without context are unreadable. Systems without documentation are opaque. Infrastructure without lived knowledge is inert. The quantity of information left behind does not guarantee that it will be intelligible. This possibility reframes the present. The question becomes not what will survive materially, but what will survive meaningfully. Names, dates, and structures are less resilient than frameworks of understanding. Awareness of limits, recognition of cycles, and humility in the face of uncertainty are difficult to encode yet essential to continuity. Earlier societies attempted this encoding through myth, ritual, and philosophy. These forms sacrificed precision for endurance. They preserved warnings rather than instructions. Over time, the warning softened into tradition. The urgency faded. The cycle resumed. This does not indicate failure of intelligence, but the difficulty of sustaining vigilance across stability. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, it may be because vigilance erodes faster than knowledge. Awareness is heavy. It requires effort to maintain. Society is optimized for efficiency, not reflection. Yet reflection is what allows patterns to be recognized before repetition becomes inevitable. This realization does not demand despair. Cycles describe tendencies, not fate. Recognition alters probability. A civilization aware of its own fragility may still collapse, but it may collapse differently. It may preserve insight even if it loses form. It may leave behind not just fragments, but understanding capable of being reassembled. Whether such preservation is possible at scale remains unknown. History offers no clear examples of long-term success, but absence of proof is not proof of impossibility. It indicates difficulty, not futility. In this light, forgotten civilizations are not mysteries to be solved, but mirrors to be consulted. They reflect the costs of neglecting memory, the consequences of mistaking stability for permanence. Their silence is instructive precisely because it is unintentional. The final insight is quiet and unresolved. Civilization is not a destination reached once and secured forever. It is a condition maintained briefly against forces that favour forgetting. The Earth does not resist this forgetting. It absorbs outcomes without judgment. What remains is compressed, not erased, waiting to be interpreted. Whether the present will be remembered as origin or as residue depends not on what is built, but on what is carried forward. Not tools alone, but awareness of fragility. Not confidence, but restraint. If earlier worlds vanished, it was not because they lacked brilliance, but because brilliance without memory cannot endure. In the end, the question of how many civilizations Earth has forgotten matters less than what the forgetting reveals. Memory is rare, continuity is fragile, and the future, like the past, will be shaped not only by what survives, but by what is understood to have been lost. The final reflection emerges not as a conclusion, but as a widening of perspective. When the long arc of history is considered without the need for certainty forgotten, civilizations stop appearing as lost anomalies and begin to resemble expected outcomes. The Earth has not selectively erased particular societies. It has treated all complexity equally, subjecting every attempt at order to the same processes of erosion, compression, and reinterpretation. What survives is not what mattered most, but what happened to endure. This understanding alters the emotional tone of history. The past no longer appears as a ladder climbed step by step, but as a landscape shaped by repeated construction and collapse. Each civilization builds upon what it inherits, unaware of how much of that inheritance is already fragmentary. What feels foundational may itself be residual. What feels original may be a reassembly whose origins are no longer visible. From this vantage, the silence before recorded history becomes less threatening. It does not demand answers. It suggests density rather than emptiness. It implies that many human worlds may have existed whose traces no longer announce themselves clearly. Their disappearance is not a failure of recognition, but a reflection of how little survives when continuity breaks. This perspective also reframes progress. Progress is often imagined as cumulative knowledge moving forward through time, yet the record shows that accumulation depends on stability, and stability is temporary. When alignment fails, progress stalls or reverses. What remains may look primitive compared to what preceded it, even though the people themselves are no less capable. Capacity persists, continuity does not. The human mind has likely always been capable of far more than any single era allowed it to express. What fluctuates is not intelligence, but opportunity. When conditions align, complexity flourishes. When they fracture, complexity thins. Over enough cycles, the difference between origin and recovery becomes indistinguishable. The earliest visible expressions of civilization may simply be the earliest that survived long enough to be noticed. This realization carries a quiet humility. It removes the need to prove forgotten civilizations in order to take them seriously. Their plausibility emerges from structure rather than evidence alone. A planet that repeatedly destabilizes environments, reshapes coastlines, and disrupts continuity is unlikely to host a single uninterrupted experiment in civilization. The expectation of uniqueness begins to look less reasonable than the expectation of repetition. Modern society often treats its own moment as exceptional because its records are extensive and its reach is global. Yet scale does not guarantee memory. In fact, scale can accelerate forgetting by amplifying dependency. When systems grow large enough, no individual understands them fully. Understanding is distributed, fragile, and easily lost when coordination fails. The more advanced the system, the harder it is to reconstruct from fragments. This vulnerability suggests that the future will encounter the present, much as the present encounters the past. Through remnants stripped of context, interpreted through unfamiliar frameworks, and shaped by assumptions that feel obvious at the time. What will be misunderstood is not technology itself, but intention. Why certain choices were made, what pressures shaped them, what was known but not preserved. In this sense, forgotten civilizations are not confined to prehistory. They include every society whose understanding failed to carry itself forward intact. Forgetting is not an ending. It is a transformation. Civilizations dissolve into influence, habit, and structure rather than narrative. Their presence lingers invisibly in what follows. The Earth accommodates this process without interruption. It does not differentiate between successful and failed societies. It compresses all outcomes into layers, leaving future observers to reconstruct meaning from residue. This indifference is not hostile. It is consistent. It is the background condition against which all human memory operates. If there is a lesson in this, it is not about loss alone. It is about responsibility. Memory does not survive by default. It requires effort, repetition, and humility. It requires recognition that stability is temporary and that continuity must be protected even when it seems unnecessary. The civilizations that endure longest are not necessarily the most powerful but the most attentive to fragility. Whether such attentiveness can persist at scale remains an open question. History offers few examples of sustained success. But it does not forbid the attempt. Awareness may not prevent collapse, but it can shape what survives. It can preserve insight even when form is lost. The idea of forgotten civilizations then becomes a mirror rather than a mystery. It reflects how easily confidence replaces caution, how quickly memory narrows, and how readily silence is mistaken for emptiness. The past does not accuse. It invites reconsideration. In the end, the Earth will forget every civilization in the same way. Time will compress effort into pattern. Meaning will thin. Context will fade. What remains will be fragments awaiting interpretation. The question is not whether this will happen, but what will pass through intact when it does. If something essential survives, it will not be proof of achievement. It will be recognition of limits, an understanding that civilization is not permanent, that forgetting is efficient, and that continuity, when it occurs at all, is an act rather than an accident. The closing question is not whether Earth has forgotten civilizations, but whether forgetting itself is the default condition of history. When viewed across deep time, permanence appears to be the exception rather than the rule. Continents drift, climates reorganize, coastlines advance and retreat. Against this scale of change, civilization is not a fixed structure, but a temporary pattern briefly stabilized before being reshaped by forces larger than the intention. What distinguishes one civilization from another is not intelligence or ambition, but how long coherence can be sustained. Knowledge does not vanish because it is false. It vanishes because the systems that transmit it fail. When continuity breaks, meaning collapses faster than matter. Tools remain without context. Structures endure without explanation. Stories survive without reference. The civilization itself becomes invisible even as its residues persist. This understanding reframes history as a process of compression rather than accumulation. Time does not neatly layer achievements into a continuous ascent. It flattens complexity, preserving fragments while erasing connection. What future observers encounter is not a complete narrative, but scattered signals. Interpretation then fills the gaps, often mistaking survivals for origins and fragments for foundations. Seen this way, the apparent beginnings of civilization are less absolute than they appear. They may represent the earliest layers that escaped erasure, not the first moments of complexity. Earlier attempts may have existed, flourished, and disappeared without leaving durable traces. Their absence does not require extraordinary explanations. It requires only interruption at the wrong moment. This perspective also challenges how uniqueness is understood. Every civilization experiences itself as unprecedented. Its tools feel advanced, its knowledge feels decisive, its records feel secure. From within, confidence is reinforced by success. From outside, viewed after collapse, that confidence appears ordinary. What felt permanent reveals itself as contingent. Modern civilization is not exempt from this pattern. Its memory systems are extensive, but they are also centralized and externalized. Understanding is distributed across institutions and technologies that few comprehend fully. This creates power, but it also creates vulnerability. When coherence depends on systems too complex to be rebuilt from fragments, forgetting accelerates. The future will not encounter the present as it understands itself. It will encounter remnants interpreted through unfamiliar frameworks. What will be lost first is not data, but context. Not infrastructure, but intention. The reasons behind choices, the pressures that shape them, the warnings that were known but not preserved will fade fastest. In this sense, forgotten civilizations are not confined to distant prehistory. They include every society whose understanding failed to survive disruption. Forgetting is not an event, it is a process. It unfolds quietly through neglect, overconfidence, and narrowing attention long before collapse is acknowledged. The Earth does not intervene in this process. It neither preserves nor destroys with purpose. It compresses outcomes impartially. Cities become sediment, roads become lines in soil, knowledge becomes pattern without explanation. What survives is determined less by significance than by durability. If there is a lesson in this, it is not one of inevitability but of responsibility. Memory is not guaranteed by achievement. It must be cultivated deliberately, especially when stability makes it feel unnecessary. Awareness of fragility is difficult to sustain because it runs against incentives for growth and certainty. Yet without it, repetition becomes likely. Forgotten civilizations do not demand rediscovery. They offer recognition. They suggest that intelligence alone does not secure continuity, and that progress without memory is fragile. Their silence is not empty, it is instructive. In the end, every civilization becomes an experiment in whether understanding can outlast circumstance. Most do not. What remains are traces that prompt questions long after answers are gone. The Earth will eventually forget all civilizations in the same way. Time will thin their stories into fragments. Context will dissolve. Meaning will compress. What determines the difference between erasure and transformation is not what is built, but what is carried forward. Not monuments, but awareness. Not confidence, but restraint. If anything endures beyond forgetting, it will not be proof of greatness, but recognition of limits. That recognition may be the rarest inheritance of all. The final layer of this inquiry turns inward toward the human impulse to seek beginnings. There is a deep comfort in believing that civilization has a clear origin, a moment when complexity first emerged and then advanced steadily toward the present. Beginnings offer orientation. They simplify identity. They allow the present to feel like an arrival rather than a position within motion. Yet the longer the record is examined, the more this desire for origins appears to be a psychological need rather than a historical reality. In practice, civilizations rarely experience themselves as continuations. They experience themselves as departures. Each believes it has crossed a threshold into something new, distinct from what came before. This belief is reinforced by disruption. When continuity breaks memory contracts, what remains feels original because context has been stripped away. Recovery is mistaken for invention. Reinvention is mistaken for creation. Over time, this misrecognition hardens into narrative. The archaeological record reflects this pattern repeatedly. Cultures emerge with mature systems of governance, symbolism, and technology, yet lack visible developmental stages beneath them. Their appearance is described as sudden, their origins unclear. Later they decline or collapse, leaving behind fragments that future societies struggle to place. Each cycle generates its own beginning, unaware of how many similar beginnings have already passed. This process is not deception, it is structural. Memory requires stability. Without it, the past becomes shallow. Depth is replaced by immediacy. The horizon of understanding contracts to what can be remembered, transmitted, and maintained under present conditions. Anything beyond that horizon disappears not because it is false, but because it cannot be carried. The temptation to treat the visible record as complete is strong. What can be dated, excavated, and categorized feels solid. What cannot feels speculative. Yet this preference ignores the mechanics of loss. Preservation is selective by nature. It favors what is durable, centralized, and aligned with power. It disfavors what is dispersed, adaptive, and embedded in practice rather than monument. If earlier civilizations expressed complexity differently from later ones, their traces may not resemble what is typically sought. Knowledge organized around movement rather than settlement, around oral transmission, rather than inscription, around ecology rather than architecture, would leave faint footprints. Once disrupted, such systems would dissolve almost entirely, leaving little to recover. This possibility complicates assumptions about what civilization looks like. Monumental architecture is not the only marker of organization, neither is writing. These are expressions of certain priorities, not prerequisites for complexity. A society optimized for resilience rather than permanence might leave almost nothing behind once displaced, yet still have possessed sophisticated understanding of environment navigation and cycles. Seen this way, the silence before recorded history is not a void. It is a filter. What passed through it were forms of a knowledge compatible with durability. What did not was compressed into absence. The absence then becomes interpreted as non-existence. This interpretation reinforces the belief that civilization is young, rare, and exceptional. The danger of this belief lies not in being wrong, but in being complacent. A civilization that believes itself unique is less inclined to recognize vulnerability. It treats collapse as something that happens to others under inferior conditions. It assumes that knowledge once gained cannot be lost. History repeatedly contradicts this assumption. Loss of knowledge does not require ignorance. It requires disruption. When transmission breaks, even advanced understanding can vanish within generations. The products remain, but the processes disappear. Tools outlast technique. Structures outlast intention. Stories outlast meaning. Future observers encounter remnants without lineage, forced to speculate. This speculation often fills gaps with narratives that restore linearity. The strange is explained away. The discontinuous is smoothed. Anomalies are isolated rather than integrated. Over time, uncertainty shrinks. Confidence grows. The past becomes manageable but less accurate. This tendency is not limited to ancient history. It operates continuously. Each generation inherits a past already filtered by previous choices. What is emphasized feels inevitable. What is missing feels implausible. The range of acceptable possibility narrows not because evidence demands it, but because coherence does. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, the forgetting likely occurred long before the present was capable of noticing. By the time fragments surface, context has already dissolved. Recognition becomes difficult not because evidence is lacking, but because expectation has been trained to overlook it. This insight reframes the question of proof. Forgotten civilizations may never be demonstrated conclusively. Their traces may be too scattered, too altered, too compressed to assemble into certainty. Yet the absence of proof does not imply absence of pattern. Structure can be inferred without detail. The pattern that emerges is one of repetition under constraint. Civilizations arise when conditions align. They decline when alignment fails. Memory survives unevenly. Each new society reconstructs its past from what remains mistaking survivals for origins and fragments for foundations. Over time, the illusion of linear progress emerges from layered forgetting. Understanding this does not diminish the present. It situates it. It removes the burden of uniqueness and replaces it with responsibility. The task is not to prove that others came before, but to recognize that continuity is fragile and must be cultivated deliberately. Memory that endures is rarely precise. It sacrifices detail to preserve meaning. It encodes warnings rather than instructions. It resists convenience. This kind of memory is difficult to sustain in systems optimized for growth efficiency and speed. Yet it may be the only kind capable of surviving disruption. If something essential can be carried forward, it will not be technological mastery alone. It will be awareness of limits, recognition of cycles, and humility before forces larger than any single society. These qualities do not prevent collapse, but they shape what follows. The Earth offers no guidance in this matter. It records outcomes without interpretation. What future observers make of the present will depend on what survives compression. Whether understanding passes through intact remains uncertain. In the end, the question of forgotten civilizations dissolves into a quieter one. Not how many worlds have been lost, but how often the same world has been rebuilt without remembering why it failed before. The answer may never be known, but the pattern is visible enough to warrant attention, especially while continuity still feels secure. The final perspective emerges when the idea of forgotten civilizations is stripped of mystery and treated as an ordinary consequence of time. When erosion, climate change, migration, and social collapse are taken seriously as continuous processes rather than rare disruptions, forgetting no longer feels exceptional. It becomes the default outcome. What stands out is not that civilizations vanish, but that any trace of them survives at all. Civilization depends on alignment. Environment, population, density, communication, and shared meaning must coincide for complexity to stabilize. This alignment is fragile. A shift in climate, a breakdown in trade, or prolonged instability can unravel it quickly. When that happens, societies do not simply disappear. They contract. Complexity collapses inward. What remains is not absence, but simplification. Simplification favors what can be carried easily. Skills that require infrastructure fade. Knowledge that depends on institutions dissolves. What survives is embodied practice, story, and habit. These forms are resilient, but they are imprecise. Over generations, detail thins, meaning drifts. What was once knowledge becomes tradition, then symbolism, then background assumption. At that point, the civilization that produced it is effectively gone, even if people remain. This process explains why continuity is so difficult to trace across deep time. The past does not vanish evenly. It fragments. Certain elements persist while others disappear entirely. Archaeology encounters this fragmentation as unevenness, dense clusters of information followed by long gaps. These gaps are often interpreted as emptiness, yet they may represent periods of survival without visibility. The concept of visibility is central. What archaeology detects is not existence but durability. Stone survives. Metal sometimes survives. Organic materials rarely do. Social organization, ecological knowledge, navigation systems, and oral frameworks leave faint traces at best. A civilization optimized for resilience rather than monumentality could vanish almost completely once displaced, leaving little behind that conforms to modern expectations of complexity. This challenges the assumption that civilization must look a certain way. Writing cities and large-scale architecture are powerful signals, but they are not universal requirements for organization or knowledge. They reflect particular priorities shaped by environment and history. Other forms of complexity may have existed that do not translate well into the archaeological record. Their disappearance is then mistaken for non-existence. The tendency to equate absence of evidence with evidence of absence becomes particularly misleading at deep timescales. Processes that erase traces operate continuously. Coastlines shift. Rivers change course. Forests consume structures. Glaciers grind landscapes flat. Over thousands of years, even stone can be reduced to anonymity. What survives does so largely by chance. Chance plays a greater role in memory than is often acknowledged. A site preserved by burial may survive while a nearby one erodes completely. A tradition recorded in writing may persist while an equally important one transmitted orally disappears. The resulting record appears selective, yet that selectivity reflects circumstance rather than significance. When civilizations are forgotten, it is rarely because they were insignificant. It is because significance does not guarantee preservation. Memory depends on redundancy, continuity, and favourable conditions. When these align, even modest societies can leave enduring traces, when they do not, even sophisticated systems can vanish with little trace. This understanding reframes the silence before recorded history. Instead of treating it as a void, it becomes a zone of compression. Many events, experiments, and ways of life may be layered into that silence, flattened by time into indistinctness. The absence of clear signal does not imply absence of activity. It implies loss of resolution. Loss of resolution is not total erasure. Patterns can still be inferred. Repeated rises and declines, cycles of settlement and abandonment, sudden appearances of organization followed by fragmentation. These patterns suggest recurrence rather than singularity. Civilization appears less like a unique breakthrough, and more like a repeated response to temporary stability. This perspective does not require belief in advanced lost empires or hidden golden ages. It requires acceptance that complexity can arise, fall apart, and arise again without leaving a continuous record. It requires humility about what can be known, and caution about what is assumed. Modern civilization often imagines itself as the culmination of a long ascent. This belief is reinforced by technological sophistication and global reach. Yet sophistication does not confer immunity. It increases dependency. Systems become efficient, but brittle. When they fail, recovery becomes difficult because redundancy has been reduced. The same forces that enable growth amplify fragility. If earlier civilizations were forgotten, they may have faced similar dynamics. Their tools differed, but the structural tension between complexity and continuity was the same. Growth strained resilience. Stability bred confidence. Memory narrowed. When disruption arrived, forgetting followed quickly. The question then shifts from what was lost to what can be carried forward. If forgetting is efficient, then preservation must be deliberate. Not preservation of objects alone, but preservation of understanding. Awareness of fragility, limits, and recurrence must be renewed continually, especially during periods of success. Such awareness is difficult to sustain because it runs counter to incentives. Growth rewards optimism. Stability encourages complacency. The warning signs of forgetting appear long before collapse, but they are subtle. Attention drifts. Maintenance is deferred. Depth is sacrificed for speed. By the time loss becomes visible, continuity is already compromised. The idea of forgotten civilizations thus becomes a mirror for the present. It reflects not a distant mystery, but an ongoing condition. The Earth does not conspire to erase memory, it simply applies time. What survives time, is what is adapted to endure it. Whether the present will be remembered as an origin, a peak, or a residue cannot be known. That determination will be made by future conditions, not present intentions. What can be influenced is the quality of what is passed through compression. Not perfection, but coherence. Not certainty, but awareness. In the end, forgotten civilizations may matter less for what they were than for what they reveal. They show that memory is rare, continuity is fragile, and civilization is provisional. They remind us that silence in the record is not empty, and that the absence of certainty is not the absence of history. What remains unresolved is not a flaw but a boundary. Beyond it lies humility. And within that humility lies the possibility that remembering even imperfectly is itself a form of resistance against time. The inquiry reaches its quiet conclusion when the focus shifts from the civilizations themselves to the act of remembering. History is often treated as a record of what happened, yet it is more accurately a record of what endured. Between those two categories lies a vast difference. Endurance is not awarded to what is most meaningful, most advanced, or most humane. It is granted to what survives pressure, disruption, and neglect. In that sense, forgetting is not a moral failure of the past, but a physical and social reality. Civilizations are not erased in a single moment. They are thinned by time. Skills narrow. Context fades. What once required explanation becomes habitual, then automatic, then invisible. When collapse occurs, it rarely destroys everything. It removes the connective tissue that holds meaning together. Without that tissue, fragments persist, but coherence is lost. Future observers encounter remnants without the framework needed to interpret them fully. This is why the past often appears paradoxical. Sophisticated achievements sit beside apparent simplicity. Precision exists without clear lineage. Systems seem complete yet isolated. These contradictions do not demand exotic explanations. They arise naturally when continuity fails. What is visible is not the whole, but what escaped compression by chance. The temptation is to resolve this discomfort by closing the narrative, to define firm beginnings, to assign clear origins, to reduce ambiguity. Yet such closure is rarely justified at deep timescales. The further back one looks, the more resolution dissolves. This does not indicate ignorance alone. It reflects the limits of what time allows to pass through intact. Civilization, when seen across deep time, resembles a series of temporary equilibria. Each equilibrium allows knowledge to accumulate briefly. Each is followed by disruption that redistributes fragments or erases that accumulation. What returns afterward is not continuity, but adaptation. New societies form from the residue of old ones, often unaware of how much has already been lost. This pattern challenges the idea that history progresses toward permanence. Permanence is not a historical outcome. It is an aspiration. The Earth does not preserve intention. It preserves form, and form alone is insufficient to carry understanding. Meaning requires continuity, and continuity is rare. Modern society often assumes it has escaped this pattern, because its records are extensive and its technologies advanced. Yet this assumption confuses scale with resilience. Large systems store more information, but they also depend on more conditions to function. When those conditions fail, loss accelerates. The more externalized memory becomes, the faster it disappears when access breaks. This is not an argument against progress. It is an argument against complacency. Progress without attention to continuity produces fragile achievement. History shows that brilliance can vanish if it is not embedded in systems capable of surviving disruption. What matters is not how much is known at a peak, but how much remains intelligible afterward. Forgotten civilizations, whether many or few, illustrate this constraint. They are reminders that intelligence alone does not secure memory, that organization alone does not guarantee endurance, that success can narrow attention as effectively as failure. Their absence is not a mystery to be solved once, but a condition to be understood continuously. In this light, the desire to count forgotten civilizations becomes secondary. Numbers imply completion. They suggest a ledger that can be closed, but history at this scale resists closure. What can be recognized instead is a pattern. Complexity arises under favorable conditions, collapses, when those conditions change and leaves behind uneven traces shaped by chance. What survives these cycles most reliably is not detail, but orientation, a sense that loss has happened before, a recognition that stability is temporary. These insights often persist in philosophy, myth, and cautionary tradition rather than in technical record. They are imprecise but resilient. They trade accuracy for endurance. The challenge for any civilization is to preserve this orientation without relying solely on crisis to renew it. Awareness of fragility tends to fade during stability. Yet stability is precisely when memory must be cultivated most deliberately. Forgetting does not wait for collapse. It advances quietly during success. If earlier civilizations were forgotten, they may have faced this same difficulty. Their greatest loss may not have been cities or technologies, but awareness of limits. Once that awareness thinned, repetition became likely. Collapse did not arrive as surprise, but as consequence. The present stands within this same structure. Whether it becomes another compressed layer or something more intelligible to the future depends not on achievement alone, but on what is preserved in forms capable of surviving disruption. That preservation is not guaranteed by abundance, it requires intention. In the end, the idea of forgotten civilizations does not diminish human history, it deepens it. It replaces certainty with scale and uniqueness with pattern. It suggests that silence in the record is not emptiness, but compression beyond resolution. And it leaves one final implication unresolved, but unavoidable. that remembering imperfectly and against time may be one of civilization's most difficult and necessary tasks. At the deeper scale, the question of forgotten civilizations dissolves into a broader reflection on how time reshapes meaning. Civilization is often imagined as something solid, cumulative, and directional, yet time treats it as provisional. What appears stable within a human lifespan becomes transient across centuries and nearly weightless across millennia. This mismatch between human perception and planetary time is the foundation of forgetting. Time does not erase selectively. It compresses. It reduces complexity into patterns that can be carried forward without context. Roads become lines. Cities become mounds. Knowledge becomes habit. Meaning thins long before matter disappears. When future societies encounter these remnants, they do not meet the living world that produced them, but its residue flattened by duration and stripped of explanation. This compression creates the illusion that civilization begins abruptly. When the earliest visible layers are examined, they seem to emerge fully formed, equipped with social order, symbolic systems, and technical skill. The long processes that preceded them are often invisible not because they did not exist, but because they did not survive in forms durable enough to cross deep time. The visible past is therefore biased toward what lasted, not toward what mattered most. Forgetting follows this bias naturally. When evidence is scarce, imagination fills gaps cautiously at first, then conservatively. Over time, uncertainty is replaced by convention. What began as provisional becomes accepted. The range of plausible history narrows until alternatives feel implausible, rather than simply unresolved. In this way, forgetting is reinforced not only by loss of evidence, but by habits of interpretation. This tendency is intensified by institutional memory. Knowledge is preserved most effectively when it serves ongoing power structures. Administrative records, legal systems, and religious texts are copied because they stabilize authority. Knowledge that challenges continuity or uniqueness is less likely to be preserved with the same care. This does not require deliberate suppression. It arises from alignment between memory and utility. Over centuries, this alignment shapes what feels historically real. Narratives emphasizing origin, progress, and destiny are reinforced. Narratives suggesting repetition, fragility, or loss are softened or relegated to myth. Myth becomes the container for what cannot be reconciled with linear history. It is tolerated as symbol, but dismissed as record even when it preserves insights that formal history cannot. Yet myth endures precisely because it is adapted to survive forgetting. It sacrifices specificity for resilience. It encodes experience rather than chronology. Floods, fires, lost ages, and vanished knowledge recur across cultures, not because they describe identical events, but because they describe shared conditions. They are memories abstracted to survive disruption. When such narratives are dismissed entirely, a form of memory is lost that may be better suited to deep time than precise record. Precision requires continuity. When continuity fails, precision collapses. Meaning, however, can persist in compressed form. This may explain why certain themes reappear even when technical knowledge disappears. Orientation survives where detail cannot. From this perspective, forgotten civilizations are not anomalies. They are expected outcomes of a system that rewards durability over completeness. The Earth is not hostile to civilization, but it is indifferent to memory. It does not preserve intention. It preserves what withstands pressure. Everything else is flattened into silence. This indifference produces a humbling symmetry. No civilization is privileged by time. All are subject to the same forces of erosion, disruption, and reinterpretation. What differs is not destiny, but timing. Some arise during periods of relative stability and leave more traces. Others rise and fall during unstable intervals and leave almost none. Both are equally real. The modern world often assumes that its technological sophistication grants exemption from this pattern. Digital storage, global communication, and redundancy create an impression of permanence. Yet these systems are deeply interdependent. They rely on energy coordination and maintenance at scales unprecedented in history. When functioning, they feel invincible. When disrupted, they fail comprehensively. This creates a paradox. The more information a civilization stores externally, the less it practices internal remembrance. Understanding becomes fragmented across systems few individuals grasp fully. When access fails, memory does not degrade gradually, it collapses abruptly. What remains is data without context structure, without explanation. Earlier societies often retained less information but preserved more orientation. Their memory systems were slower, embodied, and repetitive. They were limited but resilient. Modern systems are powerful but brittle. This trade-off has not been fully reckoned with, largely because prolonged stability has masked vulnerability. If earlier civilizations were forgotten, they may have reached similar points of confidence. Their tools differed, but their assumptions may have converged. Success narrows attention. Stability discourages redundancy. Memory is delegated rather than practiced. When disruption arrives, forgetting accelerates. This observation does not imply inevitability. It implies constraint. Civilization operates within limits imposed by time, environment, and human cognition. Awareness of these limits does not guarantee escape, but it alters behavior. A civilization that understands forgetting as structural may attempt to preserve not just records but orientation. Orientation is subtle. It cannot be fully encoded in manuals or archives. It survives through habit, caution, and humility. It resists narratives of finality. It accepts that collapse is possible, and plans accordingly. This form of memory is difficult to sustain because it conflicts with incentives for growth and certainty. Yet it may be the only form capable of surviving compression. When detail is lost, orientation can remain. When context dissolves, caution can persist. When names and dates vanish, patterns can still be recognized. This is not permanence, but it is continuity of a kind. The question of forgotten civilizations thus resolves into a quiet responsibility. Not to recover every lost world, but to recognize the conditions that produce loss. Not to seek proof of repetition, but to notice its signs. Not to demand certainty from silence, but to respect what silence implies. The Earth will continue to reshape itself. Coastlines will move, climates will shift, societies will adapt, stabilize and destabilize again. Against this motion, civilization will endure briefly, then compress. What passes through that compression will determine how future observers interpret the present. Whether the present becomes another thin layer or something more legible cannot be known. That outcome depends not on scale or achievement, but on how memory is practiced when forgetting feels distant. If earlier civilizations vanished, it was not because they lacked brilliance, but because brilliance without continuity cannot endure. In this sense, the question of how many civilizations Earth has forgotten remains open not because evidence is lacking, but because the answer is less important than the pattern. Forgetting is efficient, continuity is rare, and the effort to remember imperfectly and against time may be the most meaningful legacy any civilization can attempt to leave. The final consideration returns to scale, not of achievement, but of humility. Civilizations tend to measure themselves by what they build, record, and control. These measures feel tangible, defensible, and impressive within a single era. Yet across long spans of time, they become indistinguishable from one another. Stone erodes, metals corrode languages, drift, and systems that once felt permanent lose coherence. What remains is not dominance, but residue. This residue shapes how the past is interpreted. When future observers encounter fragments, they infer intention from survival rather than design. What lasted appears important. What vanished seems irrelevant. This reversal is subtle but decisive. It means that history is not remembered as it was lived, but as it happened to endure. Entire ways of thinking can disappear without trace, while marginal practices survive by accident. This distortion encourages false confidence in linear progress. Each surviving civilization looks backward and sees simplicity, then looks forward and sees advancement. The gaps between peaks are assumed to be empty rather than erased. Forgetting becomes invisible because it leaves no clear marker of absence. Silence feels natural when nothing contradicts it. The danger of this illusion lies in how it shapes expectation. If progress is assumed to be cumulative, then collapse is framed as anomaly rather than recurrence. Attention focuses on preventing specific failures instead of recognizing structural vulnerability. When systems strain, response tends to optimize efficiency, rather than resilience deepening dependence on continuity that may not hold. Resilience requires redundancy, restraint, and memory of fragility. These qualities rarely align with growth. They slow expansion and complicate governance. As a result, they are undervalued during periods of success. Yet they are the traits that matter when stability breaks. Civilizations that forget this lesson may excel briefly, then vanish quietly. Forgetting in this sense is not punishment. It is not. It is entropy applied to meaning. The Earth does not erase with intent. It absorbs outcomes into larger processes. Human systems dissolve into geological ones without ceremony. Rivers shift, sediment accumulates, and what was once central becomes peripheral. The planet does not mark endings, it incorporates them. This incorporation explains why so little remains of so much effort. Human time is narrow. Planetary time is vast. When these scales intersect, compression occurs. Memory that cannot survive compression is lost. Memory that adapts may persist in altered form. This is why patterns outlast particulars and why orientation matters more than detail. Orientation is the capacity to recognize limit cycles and risk without relying on constant reinforcement. It does not require full knowledge of the past awareness that the past is deeper and more complex than it appears. Such awareness tempers certainty. It resists claims of finality. It encourages care rather than conquest. Whether modern civilization can cultivate this orientation remains uncertain. Its tools are powerful, but its attention is fragmented. Its memory is vast but externalized. Its narratives emphasize innovation over maintenance and novelty over continuity. These tendencies increase reach while narrowing depth. If earlier civilizations were forgotten, they may have followed similar trajectories. Success narrowed perspective. Stability delayed caution. When disruption arrived, systems optimized for expansion failed quickly. What survived did so unevenly, leaving impressions that later generations misread as beginnings. The lesson is not that civilization is futile, but that it is conditional. It exists as long as alignment holds between environment, knowledge, and cooperation. When alignment breaks, civilization does not end dramatically. It thins, complexity sheds, memory contracts. What remains is survivable rather than comprehensive. Understanding this process reframes ambition. The question shifts from how far civilization can advance to how well it can remember across disruption. This does not mean preserving everything. It means preserving awareness of fragility itself, awareness that success does not negate vulnerability, awareness that continuity requires effort, not assumption. Such awareness is difficult to encode. It resists monumentality and spectacle. It survives best in practice, habit, and restraint. It must be renewed continually, especially when conditions feel secure. Without renewal, it fades faster than infrastructure. If nothing else is carried forward, this awareness may be the most valuable inheritance. Not knowledge of specific events, but recognition of pattern. Not certainty, but caution. Not dominance, but balance. The Earth will continue its cycles regardless. Coastlines will rise and fall. Climates will reorganize life. Societies will adapt, fragment, and reconfigure. Within this motion, some traces will survive and others will vanish. Future observers will reconstruct narratives from what remains. Whether they see the present as origin or as midpoint will depend on what passes through compression intact. Names and monuments will fade. Systems will dissolve. But if awareness survives, forgetting will not be complete. In that sense, the question of forgotten civilizations resolves. They are forgotten because meaning is heavier than material, and time carries what can be compressed across eras of human existence. We have reached the quiet edge of tonight's journey, traveller. Not a conclusion, but a soft pause. Together we moved through forgotten layers of time, through ruins shaped by patience rather than drama, through questions that resist being held too tightly. The lantern dims now, not because the path ends, but because some distances are meant to be felt in shadow. The Earth continues its long remembering without words. Ice settles. Stone listens. What was built, what was lost, what was never recorded, all rest within the same silence. The past is not finished, only folded waiting without urgency. There is no fear in this smallness, only perspective. Civilizations rise thin and pass while the planet breathes steadily beneath them. Memory drifts, meaning condenses. Some truths do not ask to be solved, only to be noticed. Perhaps that is enough for one night. To recognize that forgetting is not failure and mystery is not absence. That awareness itself is a fragile kind of inheritance, briefly carried, briefly shared. Time does not demand permanence, it allows presence. As this story settles back into the dark, you may let your thoughts loosen their grip. The questions can remain unanswered. The silence will hold them. Rest well, traveller. The universe continues its quiet work. And somewhere beyond our reach, something ancient still watches, patient, untroubled, waiting.